Born in France in 1956, Michel Danino has been living in India since 1977 and is now an Indian citizen. As an independent student of Indian civilization, he has authored papers and books in French and English. Recent titles include The Lost River, On the Trail of Sarasvati, Indian Culture and India's Future. The Dawn of Indian Civilization and the Elusive Aryans is forthcoming. Michel Danino has lectured at many cultural and higher educational institutions across India on Indus Saraswati civilization, the Aryan problem, India's scientific heritage, India's ecological traditions, and the challenges faced by Indian culture today. He was a visiting faculty at IIT Kanpur in February-March 2011 for a series of lectures on science and technology in ancient India. He is currently guest lecturer at Amrita Vidyapeetham, Coimbatore, guest professor at IIT Gandhinagar, and visiting faculty at IIM Ranchi. His other interests include forest conservation and the creation of innovative educational material. Without a further delay, I would like to invite Sri Michel Danino to give a talk on why be proud of being an Indian, 12 great achievements of Indian civilization.
Namaste. Revered Swamijis, friends of the Vivekananda Studies Circle, in fact I should say all friends also of the Vivekananda Studies Circle, because I still remember my talk here in 1999, some 13 years ago, under the same auspices, and it's a great honor for me to be here today again. And I thought that this theme would be suitable to the 150th anniversary of Swami Vivekananda. You see, I've been interacting with many students across India, and this is in fact a question I like to put to them, a little bit, as a kind of a teasing. I ask them, do you feel proud of being Indian? So the answer is always a massive yes. And I said, but can you give me a few reasons why you should be proud? And then, of course, they start thinking. And there are various answers. Some say, very broadly, we're very proud of our rich cultural heritage, so good enough. But, something more specific is a little difficult to extract at times. So I'm trying to here provide some answers, which are based on the civilizational achievements of India, because I don't look at India as a nation in the modern sense of the term. That is to say, a geographical entity with boundaries and a written constitution and so on. This is a narrow, basically Western definition of nations. I'm going to look at India as a civilization next. But before we start, could we switch off these few lights here, if possible? That will help. Before we start, I want to reel out a few facts and figures, because it's all very well to say that we are proud of being Indians, but there are also things to put everything in proper perspective that we are also probably all ashamed of. So, for instance, this is one. You can just read them. I'm not going to read them out because they are, some of the current critical areas of Indian civilization. The enormous missing of female children within Indian society, the enormous drain of money, of financial resources out of India, and this is it, and the fact that India's black economy is almost as large as the white economy. So these are facts that every Indian, of course, feels ashamed of. So how do we deal with these issues of shame, pride, and so on? First of all, I want to make a distinction between patriotism and pride. Next. The fact is that patriotism is available with almost every nation. Like, young British boy will feel very patriotic. But it doesn't mean anything. You see, during Hitler's rule of Nazi Germany, the Germans were very highly patriotic. There's no doubt about it. They were extremely proud of being Germans. So patriotism is not a guarantee of any wholesomeness. It may degenerate into any kind of fanaticism. And here I use the terminology of Swami Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo, where they made a distinction between ego-based patriotism and, next please, soul-based nationalism, where there it is a patriotism, or let us say a pride rooted in knowledge and not in ignorance. Patriotism can easily be, and is most of the time, rooted in ignorance. You do not know really what your country stands for, you do not know what values it has stood for in the stream of history, whereas this pride, as I would like every young Indian to feel it, should be, in my opinion and suggestion, should be rooted in knowledge. So let us see what we can extract from this knowledge of Indian civilization. Next, please. Before I get started, finally, one last look at persistent stereotypes and misconceptions that afflict such reflections. Next. First, and this is a colonial hangover, is that Indian culture is all about the past and cannot produce fresh or useful knowledge. This is extremely widespread in India, and many young Indians share this view. And this was, of course, the view that people like Macaulay and other, who gave themselves a mission to civilize India, propagated. And we are still inheriting it. So I hope that my presentation will be able to dispel this point. Second, Indian culture is only concerned about spirituality. Well, any serious student of Indian history will soon realize that this is quite untrue. And the times when Indian spirituality flourished the best were times when the material civilization was the most developed. For instance, during the Gupta Empire, the so-called golden age of Indian history, where all the classical features of Indian culture and heritage took root and were very richly elaborated upon. Well, this was also a time of considerable material expansion and prosperity. So India has never had a teaching, that the entire population is expected to be contemplating all the time, 24 hours a day. This has never been a mainstream of Indian civilization. Next, please. Indian culture, people sometimes concede, may produce some values which are universal anyway, but it also harbors a lot of superstition and social evils that are all holding up the country's progress. There is some truth there. It is true that you can point out to some superstitions and point out to social evils. I have already pointed out to a few, but superstitions, after all, are nothing but traditions that have outlived their time, outlived their utility, their usefulness, and that persist nevertheless. So there are some superstitions, we can accept that, but the universality of Indian culture is something I personally do not agree with. I say that Indian values are actually culture specific. They are not available all over the world, and I will try to illustrate this point later. Next. Finally, the opposite view of people who feel that they have a gut feeling that all this is not true and that India's cultural heritage is very rich, and therefore they sometimes tend to go overboard to the other extreme end of things and glorify ancient India as if it was a perfect place or perfect society or perfect stage of civilization. And that is also not correct. In fact, if you again study history objectively, you will see that Indian society was never in a stage of perfection, for the simple reason that human beings are not perfect. How can a human society be perfect without its members being perfect? And if you want to know the actual condition of, say, again, India during the Mauryan or Gupta times, you have only to do one thing. Please read the Arthashastra, and you will see the very elaborate rules, laws, punishments meted out for various kinds of crimes and so on, and corruption. But then you will see also a desire to control all this and have a smooth running of the society, which is quite praiseworthy. So Indian society was not perfect. That is not my point. But what I'm saying is that as a civilization, again, India has had some high points which deserves to be highlighted and which we can take all pride in if we remember that, of course, there were also limitations at every stage of Indian history. So with these few words of introduction, I get started, and I'm going to select 12 major achievements as I see them, but this is an open-ended list. We could add to it. And in fact, I would even invite some of you, especially the students, as a kind of exercise to even try to, compile a different type of list altogether, because then it leads you to exploring Indian civilization. The first is the Indus Sarasvati civilization, which was a remarkable civilization of the Bronze Age in the 3rd millennium BC. And you can see this map giving you the expanse of it in the northwest part of the Indian subcontinent, including the whole of today's Haryana, Punjab, much of Rajasthan, most of Gujarat and northern Maharashtra, the whole of Pakistan, even parts of Afghanistan. And this very wide area, about 1 million square kilometers, was in the 3rd millennium BC, saw the rise of cities. You've all heard the names of Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, but even in the Indian part, what is today India, there are very impressive cities like Kalibangan, Dholavira in the Rann of Kutch, in a place where today there are almost no inhabitants, and Lothal near Ahmedabad and so on. So there are all these cities come up for reasons which are poorly understood still by archaeologists. They are still being debated. And you can see also a big clustering of sites along the bed of a river, which is in blue here, which has been identified since the 19th century, not recently, since the mid-19th century to be precise, with the Sarasvati river of the Rig Veda, the Vedic Sarasvati. I'm not going to go into this. Rather, next, I will show you a few highlights, like the perfection of construction technology based on here baked bricks at Mohenjo-daro. What you see is the great bath, which was a waterproofed reservoir of water. And the present thinking consensus among archaeologists is that it was basically used for ritual ablutions, for what we would call today a holy dip, taking water for purificatory purposes, and not to have just a normal bath, because Harappans had, most of them, individual bathrooms. Even humble houses had individual bathrooms, which is something which we still are not able to achieve, in today's India. So there was a very high civic order. These bathrooms, had to evacuate their dirty waters, and this was done through a very complex and sophisticated system of drainage, which was standardized not only in Mohenjo-daro but across most of the Harappan cities on this whole huge region. So there was standardization of town planning, civic order, the Indus script, of course, which is still undeciphered, unfortunately, some artifacts, pottery styles, artistic styles, the weight system, even the width of streets, things like that was, there were people with an amazing ability to conceptualize, plan, and execute on the ground. Next, please. This is another city altogether, Dholavira, as I mentioned, in the Rann of Kutch, where here you will be bowled over by the massivity of the constructions. Everything is made mostly of stone. At least this is what remains. This is in the central part of the city where probably the rulers lived, and this is the gateway out of the so-called castle, whatever it was in reality. Very massive fortified area, and all built with these enormous stones. And here again, what the architecture tells us is a message of order, planning, execution of a very high order, because you must realize that such a city would have been built over just a few decades with hundreds, if not thousands, of laborers in a place which was totally desert. So it involved planning 1/3 of the city, nearly 17 hectares, purely for water conservation and storage. And they had thought a lot about diverting local seasonal streams during the monsoons and harvesting water on a massive scale all over the city, so that throughout the year, when the rest of the time there was not a single rainfall, this is an extremely arid area where there is no city today or no town, just not even proper villages, just tiny, tiny hamlets of people basically surviving on the extraction of salt from the Rann of Kutch, and pretty much nothing else. So these people were able to have a self-sufficient city running throughout the year, uninterrupted for some 600 or 700 years, just because they had this ability to think, plan, and execute. Next, please. I will just show you quickly some examples of cultural continuity with today's Indian traditions, symbols, gestures. On the left, you have 4,800 years ago, a figurine with a lady having red pigment at the parting of the hair. So this is clearly, and there are many more such figurines. So this is clearly the origin of, the application of sindoor at the same spot by married Hindu ladies. Whether this was the purpose here, we do not know. We have no way to tell. But the application of sindoor at this location is a Harappan tradition. On the right, you have, of course, the Namaste gesture, which is very much a Harappan gesture represented on several other figurines. Next. The swastika is one of the important Harappan symbols and represented on hundreds of tablets. As you all know, it is a sacred symbol of later Hinduism, but also Buddhism and Jainism. And this symbol, whether it had the same meaning of auspiciousness as it has later in Harappan times, again, we cannot very safely assert. But it was a sacred symbol, and therefore this is the origin of the later tradition. Next, please. Now, to summarize, what were the high points of the Indus civilization and what makes it so remarkable is, first of all, that there is no evidence of a military structure there. There's no evidence of barracks, as you have, for instance, in contemporary Egypt or Mesopotamia. There's no evidence of weapons of war. There's no depiction of any violent scene, and there is no archaeological trace of any sacking of a city or any military confrontation, which does leave archaeological traces. So it seems to have been a very largely conflict-free society, and this is something which is not very common in the ancient world. For instance, again, contemporary Egypt, Mesopotamia are quite full of depictions of warfare. You have the pharaoh conquering his neighbors, his enemies, and being glorified for these military triumphs and so on and so forth. There's nothing of this sort here. So military structure was not something which was able to keep this civilization together, and therefore archaeologists have narrowed down two features as the social cement holding it together. One was trade, and the Harappans were very great and very active and industrious traders, both internal trade as well as external trade. And the second is culture, a kind of standardization, integration of the cultural integration of the whole northwest of India. Rulers were not glorified. They are quite invisible in the archaeological record. Unlike, and again, the pharaoh of ancient Egypt, we have no idea who were the rulers of this civilization, whether there was an emperor, whether there was regional kings, which seems more likely in view of the huge distances involved. The rulers are quite, and this is a typical Indian feature until the Kushana period, where under the Greek influence, Indian rulers started being portrayed like on coins, for instance. Until then, rulers never portrayed themselves. Even Ashoka the Great. There is maybe one fresco in Sanchi, perhaps, which portrays Ashoka the Great, but that is debated by the scholar. We have no idea what he looked like. Though he had all his edicts, all over India, he never thought of portraying himself. So this kind of, discretion or self-effacement is an Indian feature. Next. High technical achievements in metallurgy, crafts, town planning, water harvesting, agriculture. I've alluded to them. There's no time to detail them, but it was a highly advanced technological civilization. Next, please. This also I have already explained. Next. Apparent economic prosperity, because we have signs of superfluous luxuries. Like in Kalibangan, there are some rooms where you see flooring tiles made of terracotta, and flooring tiles are not a necessity. Even bathrooms are not an absolute necessity. As I said earlier, even today's India doesn't have this kind of percentage of individual bathrooms. Next, please. And cultural integration of the Northwest. So for all these reasons, the Indus civilization is a high point in the historical development of this subcontinent. And it doesn't boast, of course, monumental architecture like the Egyptian pyramids or colossal temples there, or the ziggurats of Mesopotamia. But these achievements are also high achievements of the human mind. I move on in time, and I go now to the Gangetic civilization of the first millennium BC. And there, next please. There we see experiments in democracy or republicanism. If you follow such textbooks, this is from the NCERT, you will be told that democracy begins in 1947. This is what this particular textbook says. And I'm always tempted to say that in India, democracy ends in 1947. But this is just my own personal opinion. You may disregard it. In any case, the point is that we have, from the description, especially of the Buddhist texts, we have a whole description of the Mahajanapadas, or 16 proto-republics of ancient India, where there was a king, but this king was more of a nominal figurehead. He was not an absolute monarch in any way. He had to refer to the people through a system of assemblies, all the way down to village assemblies. Next, please. Next. So, next. If you go back in time to the Rig Veda, you find already some clues to perhaps some democratic structures, because Rig Veda uses several times terms like Sabha, Samiti, which speak of some collective consciousness in the society. Next, please. The Mahajanapadas had a kind of the Buddhist times, the kingdoms of the Buddhist times, or proto-republics as they are called, had a kind of unwritten constitution. And the one word unwritten constitution was dharma. So, of course, we cannot say that they were 100% dharmic. That would be too nice to assume. But they had this concept that the king was expected, to, and this is reflected very much in later texts like the Arthashastra again, that the king's primary duty was to ensure the welfare of his subject. And this was the dharma that was expected of a ruler. Next. Elaborate systems of assembly. Next. And in fact, one Canadian historian, Steve Muhlberg, summarizes the state of democracy in ancient India after a long paper which is available on the net by saying that it's especially remarkable that during the near millennium between 500 BC and 400 AD, we find republics almost anywhere in India that our sources allow us to examine society in any detail. So he in fact concludes by saying that we have to now revise our notions on the history of democracy in the world, because it is always credited to the Greeks, and it is true that the Greeks did institute something very close to our notions of democracy, but there were many Indian experiments. Next, and I'm going to show you one which, this is a possible assembly building in Harappa, 50 meters by 40 meters, the hugest building in Harappan civilization. But it was called earlier a granary, but the archaeologist decided against this interpretation, and the current thinking is that it may have been a kind of an assembly hall where the various communities were meeting. Well, this is an assumption. Hopefully one day we will know. Next, please. Now, if I move to Tamil Nadu, and the time of the Cholas were reputed, they were aggressive conquerors, and they went all the way to Indonesia on military campaigns, but they were also great administrators. And they have elaborate systems, and they have left us, luckily, elaborate inscriptions also, such as this one at Uttarameru, not very far from Kanchipuram. And there we see the whole system of assemblies all the way down to village assemblies. So for village assemblies, there was an elaborate system of election or selection of candidates. And I'm going to show you very quickly, next please, the qualifications expected from candidates. One was the knowledge of some Vedic texts, and they had to know at least some Dharma Shastra, otherwise they were not regarded as qualified. And the second, next please, is that they had to own a tax-paying land or a house. Please note the word tax-paying. This was a condition for being a candidate. Next, please. The age was 35, between 35 and 70. So I think 90% of our politicians are out of the picture by now. Next, please. This is an exact quote from the inscription: one who possesses honest earnings, whose mind is pure, and who has not been on any of the other village committees for the last 3 years. So you see, to avoid vested interests being built in time. Next, please. Disqualifications, next. One who has been on any of the committees but who has not submitted his accounts. Next. One who has stolen the property of another. Next one. Relatives of a candidate cannot be candidates. So kindly decide among our MLAs and MPs how many people will fulfill these conditions, and whether we, democracy today, how is it to be compared with democratic institutions of these times. And there's a lot more such evidence. So I regard that these democratic traditions of ancient India are a very high achievement, because they are basically what rooted this concept of democracy deep in the minds of the people. And Westerners are always surprised when they see Indian society. They say, why don't Indian revolt? Why don't we have a French Revolution in India? Why has it not happened? Because the conditions sometimes are so revolting, and it is a fact for the humblest Indians. Well, I believe that there is always some faith that some in the people, that there will be somewhere a means of redress, and that sometime perhaps their voice ultimately will be heard. And I think these traditions work at the back, and they're still working to some extent, sometimes not very smoothly, but they're still working in many villages of India. Next, please. My third point is the fact that India has undeniably been culturally united, but the process of integration was a remarkably peaceful and effective one. Next. We always speak of unity in diversity, and our textbooks also do that, but then we emphasize diversity, which is, of course, a very rich achievement in itself, but we forget about what is the unity behind this diversity. Next, please. So if you look at the Vishnu Purana, which is one of the earliest texts which try to define India, because there is this colonial concept, or misconception rather, that India was basically created by the British. And I've still heard Indians repeating that, that India did not exist before the British came, basically. But you have the Vishnu Purana at least 2,000 years ago saying the countries that lies north of the ocean and south of the snowy mountains, the Himalayas, is called Bharata. So there is a very clear, at least, geographical notion of what India is about. Next. This gets amplified into further designations in the later literature. Jambudweep, Bharatvarsha, even Aryavarta to some extent are later designations for the whole of India. Next. How was this geography interconnected? Well, there was a simple device, and the device was pilgrimage. And as you know, every Hindu or even Buddhist or Jain was expected to complete a certain number of pilgrimages during his or her lifetime. And therefore, there were dense networks of holy sites, tirthas, which created what scholars nowadays call a sacred geography. And this create, if you have to visit the Char Dham, the Dwaraka in the west, and Puri in the east, and Badrinath in the north, and Rameshwaram in the south, at least you have seen the four corners of India. And this was regarded as the barest minimum. Next, please. There are other networks, the 12 Jyotirlingas, next, or the 51, 52 Mahapithas. You probably know the story of Shiva, being in a destructive rage after the self-immolation of Sati. And Shiva carries the Sati's body on his shoulder and roams about India, basically, And he's in such a fury that his anger threatens the destruction of the universe. And one universe more or less is nothing for Shiva. It doesn't matter much. But Vishnu, whose job is to preserve the universe, runs after him and starts chopping off the body of Sati quietly, so that Shiva will, be rid of this burden. And every part of the body falls in one area or one region of India. And so we have 51 or 52 parts of Sati, that is Parvati's body, strewn all over the country. It's a beautiful image of India as being, the very body, the land being the very body of the Divine Mother. So next please, if you look at the map, this is what it says. And you can see that inclusive of Bangladesh, of course, which did not exist, and a few places in Pakistan and even in Sri Lanka, well, you have pretty much the whole map. So this was the kind of mechanisms that were put in place, the use of mythology, the use of legends, to create this cultural entity which is India. Next. Now, how did this happen actually? Next, please. Well, as I said, it began in Harappan times, but limited to the northwest of the subcontinent. And during the Gangetic civilization, the process of integration accelerated, and we see especially the Mauryan Empire expanding all over the... I'll come to that in the next slide. Next, please. It was remarkably a process which nobody could control. It was not that somebody decided, some statesman, let us say, decided, I'm going to integrate this whole landmass culturally. It just happened organically. And how did it happen organically? Next, please. It was mostly through the spread of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. It is not the Vedas. It is not much the Upanishads, which were, regarded as perhaps a little too lofty for the common masses. It was basically the two epics that spread like wildfire, and that, you see, gave the people the total freedom to adopt them, to adopt Krishna, Rama, their ideals, their teaching and so on, and even to recreate, to rewrite, if necessary, various regional versions, translations, adaptations, modifications of the two epics. And this happened even in the whole of Southeast Asia, even all the way to Indonesia. The epics were extremely popular. And this freedom was such that it is difficult to find a place in India where you will not have people claiming that, Rama came this side, or Krishna came this side, or Hanumanji flew over this place, and so on. Even, near my place in Coimbatore, in the Nilgiris, there is a shola called Bandi Shola. And in Bandi Shola, there is a small shrine where you have a hero stone. These hero stones are very commonplace in South India, but usually they are dedicated to one village chieftain or hero. But here, the story of the hero stone is the story of the Pandavas. 5 registers, and the life of the Pandavas is described. And who keeps this hero stone? The Kurumba tribals, not Brahmins or, tribals. And they will tell you that the Pandavas came this way, because somebody always comes this way. And this is how basically you unify culturally the whole land. And it doesn't matter if it has a historical truth or not. It has a cultural truth, and that is what really matters. Next, please. Further, in this process, no pre-existing regional culture, like for instance tribal cultures or folk cultures, was stamped out. And this is a unique Indian way of doing things. You see, when, and again these are historical facts, when Christianity and Islam spread, they did stamp out earlier cultures, because that was their self-declared mission. And that is why, for instance, in Europe you have no pre-Christian culture. In the Islamic world you have no pre-Islamic culture. The Parsis or Zoroastrians exist only in India. They don't exist in Islamic countries. So this is a different phenomenon at work, and we have to acknowledge the difference. So my definition of Hinduism, very personal definition, but I think somewhere Swami Vivekananda says something similar. I have forgotten the exact quote, is that I define Hinduism as the interface between Vedic and regional folk and tribal cultures. That interface, fusion, interchange is what becomes Hinduism. Hinduism borrowed a lot from tribal cults. Many Hindu gods, like forms of the Mother, Ganapati, Narasimha, Jagannath of Puri, are basically tribal gods. And in reverse, tribals borrowed also from the Hindu pantheon. And this was a perfectly, smooth and organic process where nobody really lost anything. Everybody was enriched in the process. So Rabindranath Tagore therefore says that India has all along been trying experiments in evolving a social unity within which all the different peoples could be held together, while, and this is very important, fully enjoying the freedom of maintaining their own differences. So difference was respected. This has produced something like a United States of a social federation whose common name is Hinduism. So whether this is politically correct as a statement or not, you will kindly decide, but this is a historical fact. Next, please. And even for those who say that there was no political unity in ancient India before the British unified this landmass, well, this is not quite true either, because this is a map of the Mauryan Empire. Of course, the Mauryans, Chandragupta or Ashoka, did not directly rule this enormous region. They did so through local rulers who had, accepted the overlordship of the Mauryas. But you can see that barring what is today Tamil Nadu and Kerala, it was the whole subcontinent was politically unified, inclusive of what is today Bangladesh, parts of Burma, and the whole of Pakistan and Afghanistan. So the concept of political unity was already there in India. Later empires like the Gupta, the Shatavahana, the Pratihara, and so many others tried to recreate this political unity. They did not succeed to this extent for all kinds of reasons, but at least the idea that India should be made one, even at a political level, did exist. Next. My fourth point is India's interface with other civilizations, which is pretty much a repetition of what happens within India. Next, please. Where we see from Harappan times a desire to travel out of India and explore and exchange with other civilizations. So you have here in the west, Iran, Magan, which is today's Oman, Dilmun, which corresponds more or less to Kuwait and the Emirates, and Mesopotamia. Elam is the northwest region of today's Iran, and in Central Asia, Bactria and Marjana across the Hindu Kush. These regions are full, not full, but Harappan artifacts, Indus seals, jewels have been found in all these parts. And very interestingly, objects from those civilizations are not found back here in Harappan cities. So there's a big mystery there. What did the Harappans import in return of their exports? Perhaps some recyclable goods like copper or maybe some silver, or maybe some perishable food items or something of the sort. But they were reaching out, and their physical traces are prominent all over this huge region. Next, please. In later times, Roman Empire, well, pretty much the story repeats itself. We find the Romans importing a lot of stuff from the coastal India, especially western and southern India, and they imported spices, especially pepper. They imported timber, a lot of teak wood for the Roman navy, for instance. They imported textiles, etc. And the trade balance, again, was very much in India's favor. In fact, Roman historians complain that the Roman treasury is being depleted because of the Roman ladies' taste for Indian spices and jewelry. So this was a peaceful interaction. South India is full of Roman coins, which testify to the intensity of the trade. And the Romans would cross from Kerala overland across the Palghat Pass all the way to the eastern ports to trade further with the people coming from Southeast Asia. Next, please. Central Asia, of course, saw a massive expansion of Buddhism and Hinduism. Along with Buddhism, you have here one of the two famous Bamiyan Buddhas, which were, as you know, dynamited by the Taliban a few years ago. This is a curious phenomenon because even after the demise of Buddhism, when various Islamic dynasties, Afghans, Turks, Mongols, etc., ruled in these Central Asian regions, they never felt the need. Even Genghis Khan, while passing through, didn't feel the need to demolish those Buddhas. But in our 20th, 21st century, it happened. So this was a most important center for the diffusion of Buddhism. You can see the tiny halls at here at the bottom of the mountain. These were actually cells where the monks were living, copying manuscripts, translating them into various languages, spreading them further afield, and so on. So India pretty much colonized, culturally speaking, much of Central Asia. China was, seduced by Buddhism, and the whole of Southeast Asia all the way to Japan. Next, please. So we can move. Well, this is just a Chinese painting showing one of the famous Chinese pilgrims returning to China after receiving a gift of an elephant from King Harsh in the 8th century. But the elephant carries not gold or jewels, but manuscripts. This is the load on the elephant back. This is what the Chinese tell us. Next. Angkor Wat is a famous example of the spread of Hindu architecture. This is in Cambodia, and this is the single largest temple, Hindu temple in the world. It is of enormous proportion, but the whole principle of the architecture with Mount Meru, the axis of the universe, being the central tower, is absolutely rooted in classical Hindu architecture. Next. Well, depictions of Krishna preaching the Gita to Arjuna in an Indonesian painting. Krishna stands left of the tree and Arjuna right of the tree. So this is a different setting that we are not used to, but it is the same message ultimately. Next. And even in Japan, evidence of Vedic rituals. This is from a Japanese manuscript, and this is a homam kund, or a fire altar. You can recognize the Vajra of Lord Indra being depicted below the flames. Next, please. There would be quite a lot more to say. Even in the West, not just in the East, there are traces, unmistakable traces of Indian influence, like this figurine of the Celtic culture of Ireland, pre-Christian culture, where this person is seated in Padmasana with 4 swastikas on the chest. And this influence is well accepted by Celtic experts. Next, please. Yoga continues to be a very rich gift of Indian culture to the world, and these 2 covers of Time magazine testify to it. About 15 to 20 million Americans today practice some form of yoga or meditation. And all over Europe also, you have thousands of small centers teaching some form of yoga or meditation, and sometimes of a Hindu kind, sometimes of a Buddhist kind, sometimes of some mixed sort, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that there is a kind of a need among Westerners for something which India can supply and which they do not find in their own culture or values. Next. My 5th, and from this point onward we'll be moving a little faster because I'm coming to better known areas, is India's perspective of nature. That is to say, the sacredness of nature in Hindu and Buddhist thought. And this is something, unfortunately, that we have lost with our very rapid present development. But the Rig Veda was putting right from the beginning heaven and earth on the same footing. It is not that the earth was inferior in any way. The whole creation was regarded as divine. And it said also, it compares also the universe to a 1,000-branched tree, which is a very beautiful image of, again, unity in diversity. Unity is the trunk, and the diversity is all the branches and all the different leaves. But they are all connected to one trunk. And if you deny the trunk, of course, the tree will die. So this is taken over again in the Mahabharata. He who worships the Ashwatha, that is to say the peepal tree, worships the universe. So there is a very clear, symbolism at work here. Next. And reverence for features of nature like mountains, rivers. This is a deification of Ganga and Yamuna. You can see the water pot that they're holding. Ganga is standing on a crocodile, or gharial to be precise, and Yamuna on a tortoise. So this is a way to imbue nature with divinity, and therefore to respect the elements of nature. And a science also for treating trees, plants, crops, preparing seeds even for sowing. This is part of Vriksha Ayurveda, which is itself a part of Ayurveda. So we have many texts on these techniques, and some of them have been tested and found to be quite effective also. Next. The tradition of sacred groves in many parts of India. Tamil Nadu has this Koil Kadu, and they are basically places which were inaccessible to the common villager. They were sanctuaries which were entered only for ritual purposes. Here you have these huge terracotta figures which are going to be ritually broken at every spring. There is a ritual, and then new terracotta statues will be installed, and this clearly symbolizes the death and rebirth of nature every year, the cycle of seasons, if you like. So these forests were untouched, and of course the tradition has broken down to a large extent, but there are many NGOs trying to preserve whatever is left of these sacred groves. And this is available in many parts of India. Next. Even you can see here Tiruvalluvar giving us a very peculiar thought that sparkling water, open space, hills and forests constitute a fortress. In other words, these elements of nature are our defenses. And if we neglect or destroy them, then we will be defenseless. This is a strong ecological message long before our so-called ecological consciousness of recent times. Next. Structures of water harvesting. These are massive ones of Dholavira, which I evoked in Harappan times. Enormous reservoirs containing millions of cubic meters of water. Next, please. Elaborate reservoirs also in the Gangetic civilization. This is at Sringverpur, the place where theoretically, according to Ramayana, Rama and Sita crossed the Ganges. And here archaeologists found very elaborate systems of reservoirs interconnected, which will fill up when the Ganges goes into spate, and any excess water is returned to the Ganges, so there is no wastage. And these reservoirs will be available for the people when the river, the water level goes down in the river. Next. Next, please. So these resulted in a lot of, to me, practical ecological tradition. First, the sacredness of nature. Next, the interconnectedness of all creatures. In fact, even the vahanas, the vehicles of the gods, a reflection of this symbolism. Next, please. The concept of milking and not conquering nature. You see, the Westerners always spoke of conquering nature perhaps because in the Bible, all the creatures are given for man to be the master of. And there is, God tells man, you will rule over all these creatures. Well, this concept is totally absent here in India, and it is rather a concept that we are all interdependent. Next, please. Respect of all life forms, therefore. Next. Simplicity of living, which is quite crucial in Indian culture. Not asceticism. Asceticism was restricted to a few who chose for any reason to be ascetics. But the concept of living in India was not asceticism, rather it was simply being happy with little, having limited needs and being quite satisfied within that. Whereas the Western concept has been more and more to be unhappy with much. That is to say, consumerism and less growing consumption of all kinds of things which ultimately you don't really need to be happy in your life. So here also we have different values at work. Next. Sixth, this will hardly require a minute. This is the notion of Swadharma and Swabhava. Swabhava is, of course, our own individual nature. And there was a recognition in India always that we are all different from each other. And therefore, why should there be a single path for all of us? If we are different, then there should logically be different paths for all of us if we are looking for even spiritual fulfillment. And therefore, this concept of Swadharma, not only individual duties, that is true, this is another interpretation of Swadharma, but also individual spiritual paths, which resulted in this mind-boggling diversity of sects and teachings and masters and different even disciplines of yoga and so on and so forth. So this recognition of spiritual pluralism is at the root of not only spiritual freedom in India, but something which we wrongly call tolerance. In India, it is not tolerance, it is rather rejoicing in the diversity, not only accepting the other, sometimes even barely, tolerance almost means that I tolerate you because I have perhaps no choice. So I barely tolerate you. But this is not the Indian value. The Indian value is rather to accept as inevitable and as enriching the diversity and the multiplicity of paths. Next. Yes, I think we can skip that. I have already explained. Yes, please go on, please go on. Please go on, yes, thank you. And then we come to scientific and technological advances, a field which I've been studying for some years. And next, please. Here, there's no way I could even spend a few minutes to give highlights. It would be too superficial. I'm just showing you this map, which places as precisely as we can on the map the well-known Indian mathematicians and astronomers of classical times. So you can see Aryabhatta, for instance, where Patna is today located in Bihar. You can see Brahmagupta in Ujjain along with Varahamihra. You can see Bhaskaracharya somewhere in Karnataka, though he may have been in Maharashtra. You can see later on the high achievements of the Kerala School of Mathematics and Astronomy. And we have many texts from all these scientists and more. But unfortunately, that is even a small drop in the ocean. We have perhaps not even 10% of the scientific texts available today in India have been read and translated, or published even. There was our great scholar K.V. Sharma, who lived here in Chennai till 2002 or 3, 2005, I think. And K.V. Sharma, who was a great scholar of science in ancient India, published a book on the manuscripts of scientific texts deposited in libraries of Tamil Nadu and Kerala. And his conclusion was that only 7% of these scientific texts had been read and published, leave alone translated. So 93%, nobody really knows what is there. So this is the state of our scholarship. We have not, favored professions like archaeology, epigraphy. They're not regarded as prestigious professions for bright young people like you, and therefore we have almost no epigraphists left in India, and all this wealth is just lying and slowly, of course, disappearing. Next, please. 8, spiritualization of art and literature. Again, there isn't much that needs to be said here. Next. You know that much of the great accomplishments of architecture, as this slide shows, or music, or painting, or sculpture, or even performing arts like drama, basically in India have always a kind of a sacred background. They are not secular in the current acceptance of the term. There is always, even if you look at Kalidasa's plays, there are always sacred concepts, a sense of dharma, always peeping in at almost every second line. So this sacred concept behind in the arts, and especially all the enormous architectural wealth, heritage wealth that is visible to an outer eye, is something remarkable. In the West, by contrast, it's only a small portion of the arts that are sacred. There is a little bit, of course, of sacred Christian music and literature and so on, but most of it is not directly relatable to a sacred context. So most of it, you may say, is secular art, but in India, the proportion is reversed. Next. Number 9, systems of yoga. I've already alluded to the contribution of yoga to the world, which is, to my mind, one of the most important that non-Indians can instantly relate with. Next, please. And this tradition in India is traceable to Harappan times. There are evidences of figurines in hatha yogic postures, various postures, and even the presence of meditation as portrayed here in this figurine from Mohenjo-daro. It's a tiny figurine, and you see this person, whoever he was, we don't know who he was, but you see him deep in contemplation. And this is something uniquely Indian. Other seals, like this one, represents gods. We don't know who these gods are. We can't identify them in yogic postures. Next, please. This is a remarkable photograph which came to light only a few years ago, extremely recent, of archaeological finds in the Aravalli hills. There is a particular culture there which goes back to Harappan times, but it is not a Harappan culture. It is a rural culture, very limited in geographical terms. And at least 2 skeletons in this Aharbana sculpture were found to have been buried in Padmasana. And as you know, in later classical India, it is a tradition often to bury usually people with spiritual accomplishments, realizations in Padmasana. But sometimes also some members of the family, I'm been told, were buried in this way. So anyhow, this is, I find, quite spectacular. Next, please. And this dates to the 2nd millennium BC. My 10th point is about the 19th century Renaissance in spirituality, art, and science. And this is so well known that I'm not going to spend much time on it, but nevertheless, let us just refresh our memory and remember that people like Bankim, like Rabindranath Tagore, like Subramanya Bharati, and many others revolutionized, Indian literatures. And this is something the British did not expect. They thought, after Macaulay, that English was going to be adopted wholesale in India and would basically create a kind of brown England here, and that there was nothing much in Indian literatures and languages that was worth preserving. And just the opposite happened, when suddenly all these regional literatures awoke and were regenerated by various such figures. Next. In art also, the same thing happened. You've all heard of Abanindranath Tagore and the Bengali school of painting. This was a unique attempt to be faithful to the old spirit of Indian painting, but in new forms. Next. In science also, there were great scientists like Jagadish Chandra Bose, C.V. Raman, S. Ramanujan, who were modern scientists in a way, and yet rooted in some Indian concepts. For instance, the concept of life, plant life, which J.C. Bose promoted, was very much rooted in this Indian idea that there is consciousness in everything, including in plants. Next, please. Social reformers, plenty of them. And last but not least, in fact, foremost, a spiritual renaissance, which in fact fueled the others, and which were spearheaded by great figures like Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, Sri Aurobindo, and quite a few others. And this is also something which totally altered the cultural landscape of India, and which was not expected by the British rulers. Next. Number 11, and I'm almost done. Rejuvenating the 19th century Western literature, thought, and humanism. This is something less known. The way Indian texts, when they got translated into European languages, by, of course, Europeans themselves, right from the late 18th century onward, brought about a kind of revolution in many, literary circles in the West. For instance, you've all heard of the Romantic movement in literature and philosophy. Well, it was really fueled by Indian ideas about precisely the sacredness of nature and other such concepts. And we find, next please, that a lot of Western philosophers, I'm not going to read out these, and there are websites where you can find hundreds of these. There's a beautiful website called, I think, hinduwisdom.com, where you find hundreds, if not thousands, of such, high praise for Indian culture, philosophies, spiritualities, arts, and so on, by great Western figures, sometimes themselves philosophers, poets, writers, etc. Even in France, this is not so well known, but I did myself a little study of the deep impact of Indian thought and spirituality on French literature in the 19th century, and that's quite a lot to say. So this kind of fed the West with new concepts which were slowly assimilated and no longer recognized as Indians, if you like, but they became a source of enrichment for Western thought. Next. And at the same time, in the 19th century, Indian ideas were seen to be compatible with findings of modern science. For instance, the huge astronomical scales which the Christian Church so fiercely opposed because their chronology was much more limited in time, were found to be quite compatible with Hindu, Jain, Buddhist cycles of time. Next, please. When Swami Vivekananda was in New York, if I remember correctly, or in America somewhere, he met Nikola Tesla, who was, of course, a great physicist and engineer, and he told him about how in Vedanta matter and energy basically would be seen as equivalent. And Tesla promised to get back to Swamiji very shortly with the mathematical proof of that. But of course, he was not, equipped to work out that equivalence. It was the job of Einstein a few years later. But it's interesting to see how Swamiji anticipated without having the scientific background, but anticipated the truth that the theory of relativity was going to come up with. Similar things with Schrödinger, Heisenberg, Oppenheimer, Bohm, all of whom acknowledged their debt to Indian concepts and thought. This is something we have lost sight of. So Fridtjof Capra, in his famous Tao of Physics, I'm not going to read this, comes up with this great parallel between the dance of Shiva and the dance of particles. Next. And as a result, at the CERN, the Centre Européen de Recherche Nucléaire, that will be European Center for Nuclear Research, where they are now looking for this so-called Gauss particle, this boson which is elusive, and they have installed, the government of India, which once in a while can do something good, here has installed a statue of Nataraja, and on the plaque of this statue, this quotation of Fridtjof Capra is given to show this concept that the whole universe is basically a dance of energy, and this is something intimately connected with modern physics. Next, please. Finally, well, the very fact that Indian civilization survived at all is, I think, perhaps the greatest achievement of all, and it is not at all, it is something we take for granted, but there's no reason, in fact, why Indian civilization should have survived. There's every reason why he should have disappeared. So I'm not going to propose even, or pretend to propose reasons, it is an individual exercise that all of us should be doing. Why is it that this civilization persisted when ancient Egypt disappeared long ago, ancient Greece disappeared long ago, Mesopotamia is completely gone, and even China has a very slender thread with its ancient culture, like Confucianism and Taoism, because most of it was snapped by the Cultural Revolution of communism. So how is it that this land was able to of course, still under modern challenges of invasions of Western culture and so on, but nevertheless, how is it that it was able to preserve this thread of continuity? So this is a great achievement in itself. And my final slide is about a few things that India did not contribute to humanity. And I will leave you with these few words to meditate upon. Next. Wars of religion, we have none in India. We have some examples of religious intolerance, and once in a while they're degenerating into physical violence, but very isolated, rare cases, which are extremely minor compared to Europe's bloody and wars of religion over many centuries. Next. Colonial conquest and plunder is something India never indulged in. Next. Slave trade, which is a result of colonialism, is also not to India's credit. Next. Genocides, and again, colonialism did result in the death of hundreds of millions of people all over the globe, in the Americas, in Africa, in Asia, and well, India has no such record. Next. World wars, again, not to India's credit column. Next. Concentration camps, and so on and so forth. So the West is very proud of its achievements, and there are great achievements in the West. I'm not trying to denigrate the West in any way. There's even no use in trying to compare and say this is greater than that. That is not the point. But what I say is that when all is said and done, India's civilization has stood for some values and has lived them to some extent. And if we investigate them properly, then we know why we can legitimately claim this sense of pride in belonging to this stream of civilization. Thank you very much.
Thanks, sir, for such an informative talk. We'll have one or two quick question answer session here, and the more detailed question answer we can have afterwards, after the second talk. So if you have any question, specific question, you can directly ask.
When you talked about Ganges civilization, you talked about, the Cholas period, you talked about the knowledge of Vedas to be one of the criteria for anyone to get elected. So any idea when the Vedas came into existence in the collective consciousness of the civilization?
I think the date of the Vedas is such a controversial issue that it would take a long, long time to even present to you the various schools of thought. The conventional school of thought is that the Vedas were composed about 1200 BC, after the Aryans came into India and settled, in the northwest of the subcontinent. But there are more and more scholars, I happen to be one of them, who have rejected the whole concept of the Aryan invasion theory and do not see the need for any, outside immigration into India. So in that case, we would have to rethink the whole of the Rig Veda, which itself never speaks of such an immigration, never. It regards the Northwest as its homeland. So then there are many, proposals. Some of them say that during Harappan times, perhaps the Vedas were already composed. I think the issue is just too wide and complex to go into. But my own opinion is that the Rig Veda might even predate the Harappan civilization by a little bit, which doesn't mean that the Harappan civilization has to be wholly Vedic. It is a popular culture, but there would be some discernible influences of Vedic culture in it. But that's a big topic in itself.
You had mentioned that there is no evidence of warfare in the Indus culture, but the puzzle is that the only surviving literary tradition from that period is the Vedas, but the Vedas do have mention of a lot of warfare and glorification of rulers as well. So how do we explain that?
Well, the Puranas also speak of a lot of warfare between the Devas and the Asuras, but nobody takes them as physical events. And it's pretty much the same in the Veda, but unfortunately we are under the influence of the colonial readings that transform these mythological battles into physical ones between two opposite races, of one, the Aryan race coming into India, and then the indigenous race consisting of the Dasyus or Dasas and so on. There's no reason to accept that these battles were physical ones, and in fact, if you see, there is a clear mythological language used in the Rig Veda. For instance, the Dasyus and Dasas live in caves at the bottom of mountains. Well, nobody lives in caves at the bottom of mountains in India. Even tribals have never really lived in caves. They've lived in settlements. And then they keep horses and cows closed, shut up in these caves. And sometimes these horses and cows are actually rivers. And then Indra and the rishis and the so-called Aryans, though they are not described as Aryans in the Veda, come and wage war against these and free the cows, free the rivers, etc. So this is a mythological language. We have to understand the symbolism. There is absolutely no clue that these are very real battles to be taken physically. In any case, whatever ultimately our choice of the reading of the Rig Veda may be, the fact is that the Harappan cities have not been destroyed by man. There is no such evidence, at least as of now. So we have to keep the question open.
Excuse me. Was the Indian, means like you have highlighted the Indian belief or the Hindu culture which has thrived across the Indian subcontinent. Was the partition of India in 1947 necessary? Was it a necessary act or an unfortunate incident?
I think this is going to be just a matter of personal opinion, because it's a political issue. Many prominent Indian figures did not want the partition, and they try to advocate against it. But the political forces at play at the time, of course, the British were actively working towards it. Churchill made no secret that he wanted a partition because he wanted to weaken India. And ultimately these designs prevailed. There was a lot of disunity, not only among Hindus and Muslims, even among the forces like the Congress leaders. There was a lot of disunity. There was perhaps a lack of clarity and of what would be the right strategies for a unified India to exist. I am not really, I don't feel competent to pass judgment over the freedom fighters of those times. I'm not sure I would have done much better than they did. And the historical circumstances have been that. We have to accept that, but we have to look forward into the future and decide whether in 100 years, 200 years, what's going to happen to this subcontinent. Is India even going to survive, the rise of fragmenting forces, which quite undeniable today, whether Naxalites, whether all kinds of people, claiming independence for this part and that part. So these are very big questions. I think I would like to put the question more in the future rather than in the past.
In the light of the great civilization, how do you think we can use those learnings in the current context?
How do I think I can use the?
How do you think we can use that knowledge in the current context?
You see, a country cannot survive without a sense of belonging by its citizens. And there has been so much confusion about what India is about. And I find a lot of young Indians also quite confused, quite unable to. It's very difficult to even define India. If you try to, it's almost impossible. So I think that these explorations are useful because they end up defining India in an empirical manner. You may not have a theoretical definition of what India is about, but empirically you can say that yes, India is that land which achieved all these things. And this is as good a definition as any other. In fact, maybe a better one, because then you can readily identify with this land, with these values, with these concepts. And this, in fact, gives you a sense of belonging. And if this, becomes widespread in the population, this will be the best way to prevent further fragmentation, what I was just talking about just now, further fragmentation of the land. Because otherwise, India has always survived on a very delicate cultural cement. And if this cultural cement goes, which is what quite a number of people in India today want, if this cultural cement eventually goes, well, what is it that can hold this land together? This is the question in front of us. So I think this knowledge can have this very practical result of strengthening the national cement.